So now we're on to the second piece of the blood lecture. We're going to go into blood typing. And while we do this, I strongly recommend that you print out the blood typing worksheet that's on Canvas and fill it out while I'm talking. I strongly recommend that you try to do that. I think that's going to be the easiest way to make sure that you understand as we go through. Okay, so we're going to talk about blood type. For the human blood types, there's actually several different factors, but there's two that are the most important, and we'll talk about why in a minute. And the two most important are going to be the ABO system and then the RH system. So when you think about your blood type, say mine is B negative, right? The B part is part of the ABO system, and then the negative part is part of the RH system. Okay, so to make it easier, I'm separating those two from each other. So let's start with the ABO system first. So when we think about blood type, I need to give you some background information and some terminology that you need to know. The first one is antigen. Now, here we have a cell. On the surface of the cell, which means that it is embedded in the plasma membrane, you have those little protein markers. Remember we talked about the fluid mosaic model, where you have little proteins that float around. Those little proteins can sort of identify those cells. Okay, so those proteins that are found on the surface of the cells, those are called antigens. And the way I like to think of antigens is they're like little name tags that say, I am part of this cell and I am part of this body. Okay, so they're little name tag, little markers found on the surface. Okay, so remember these are proteins, which means they are physical markers found on the surface of the cell that identify the cell as part of the body. They're self-tags. Okay, so that's going to be how the immune system is able to distinguish self versus non-self. Okay, so the next thing we need to talk about is alleles. Okay, so because antigens are physical proteins, they are going to be coded for in DNA. Because remember that DNA is the code, the blueprints to make those proteins. So let's look at DNA genetics just a tiny bit. So remember that we are diploid, because for most of our genes, we have two copies, and that's because we have two copies of almost all of our chromosomes except for the sex chromosomes. Okay, so two, or for male. So we have a maternal chromosome, which means that our mom gave that one to us, and we have a paternal chromosome, our dad gave that one to us. So chromosomes 1 through 22, maternal and then paternal. And then the last one, the 23, is the sex chromosome. So because we are diploid, we have two genes. We have two copies of the genes. Okay, now if you look at a gene, so a gene is going to code for one protein, but there are variations in those proteins. So the variations of one particular gene is called an allele. Okay, an allele. Again, another A word, an allele. So let me give you an example to help figure that out. So just to simplify this, let's say we're looking at flowers. Okay, and for those flowers, there's one gene that codes for the color of the petals. Okay, so some of those flowers can have purple petals, and some of those flowers will have white petals. So the gene in this scenario would just be petal color. It codes for that very specific physical trait. Now, there's different variations of that petal color. So there's different alleles. Okay, so what would be the two alleles that I mentioned? You have an allele that codes for purple petals, and then you have an allele that codes for white petals. So both of them are for the gene petal color, but they're different variations of the same gene, so they are different alleles. So please remember that alleles are your DNA, and you have a maternal and a paternal one, so you'll have two alleles for that gene. And then Antigens are your physical proteins found on the surface of the cells. So the alleles code for the antigens. Okay, so now let's bring this into the ABO system. For humans, we have 3 alleles that code for the ABO system. So 3 different variations. We have A alleles, and A alleles code for A antigens. We have B alleles, and B alleles code for B antigens. So this means that in your DNA, if you have an A allele, you will have an A antigen. And if you have a B allele, you will have a B antigen. Okay, so it's what we call codominance here. Now, those ones people usually get. The one that is a little confusing for some people is that our 3rd allele type is called an O allele, but there's no such thing as an O antigen. The O allele codes for nothing, no antigen on the surface of the cell. Okay, so think of the O allele more like a little placeholder, a nothing, a 0 maybe. Okay, so let's look at how that goes into creating our blood type. So remember that we are diploid, so you'll have 2 alleles, but and those alleles will dictate or create your physical proteins, which would be the antigens. So if you are type A blood, type A blood means that you have type A antigens. No B antigens, just A antigens. That's why it's called type A. So what allele combinations would give you that A antigen? There's 2 of them. The first is that one of your parents gave you an A allele, and then the other parent also gave you an A allele. So 2 A alleles. This one codes for A, that one codes for A. A plus A makes A. Okay, so that's one way that you can get type A blood with A antigens. The other way that you can get type A blood is that one parent gave you A allele, and again, it doesn't matter which parent it is, just one of them. One of them gave you an A allele, and the other one gave you an O allele. If you have this one coding for A, and the other one, the O allele coding for nothing, A plus nothing still makes A. Okay, so if you're a type A person, so you know your blood type is type A, you can't figure out which of these 2 allele combinations you have unless you also know the blood types of all of your parents and grandparents. But you could figure it out. Okay, so 2 ways to get it. Now, type B, I think you can get it the same as A, either 2 B alleles or B and an O. Now, for type AB, remember, type AB means that you have both an A antigen and a B antigen, and there's only one way you can get that physical trait. One of your parents gave you an A, the other one gave you a B allele. Okay, so again, it does not matter who gave you what. It doesn't matter maternal versus paternal. It's just that one of them is an A and the other one is a B. Okay, what about type O? What antigens are found on type O blood? Type O means nothing. Okay, you don't have A antigens and you don't have B antigens. Okay, so there's again only one allele combination that can give you that. Both of your parents gave you O. So O means nothing, O means nothing, nothing plus nothing make nothing. Okay, so if you're type O, you know your genetic makeup. Okay, so what I really would like you to do is go ahead and pause it and start working on just the first 2 columns of the worksheet. Make sure you really understand the antigens and the alleles. Okay, so my suggestion for you is to actually figure out the antigen column first. So figure out what physical proteins would be expressed on the surface of the cells for each of those pieces. And then try and figure out what allele or DNA combinations would create those physical proteins. Okay, and I'm going to show you the answers at the end. It's also on Canvas. Okay, so now let's talk about, well, why is blood type so important? Okay, so let's think about that for a second. It has to do with your immune system. The function of your immune system is to attack anything that is foreign. Notice I did not say anything that is bad. I said anything that is foreign. So the function of your immune system is to get rid of anything that is not self. Okay? And so what it does is it creates antibodies. And those antibodies will specifically lock to, again, they're proteins, so lock and key model. They're going to specifically bind to any antigens that are not part of the own body, not self antigens, and mark them for destruction, and they're going to destroy those cells. Okay, so that means that if you put the wrong blood type in there, it's going to cause those blood type, the new cells to be attacked. Okay, so I need you to know, well, what types of antibodies will be created by each blood type. Now, for the ABO system, these antibodies are going to be present from birth. They do not require an initial exposure. You already have them, which is strange when you think about it. So we'll always have them. So if you are type A, remember, type A means you have A antigens. Your A antigens are your self antigens. That means that you do not want exposure to type B, because type B antigens are not self. They are foreign. Okay, so what antibodies are you going to make if you're type A? You would make antibodies that bind and destroy type B. Okay, so any antigens that are not your own antigens have got to go. Okay, so if you're type A, you have A antigens, you're going to make antibodies that bind and destroy type B antigens. If you're type B, that you have B antigens, and you're going to create antibodies that bind and destroy anti-A. Okay, so anti just means it's antibodies that bind to A antigens. Okay, now those ones make sense. Now, what about if you are type AB? Remember, for AB, you have both A antigens and also B antigens. Notice that there's no such thing as AB antigens. It's A and also B. So that means that you don't want to make antibodies that bind to either of those, because if you did, you would destroy your own cells. So that would mean that you're not producing any antibodies. Whereas if you're type O means you don't have any. You don't have A, you don't have B. And so if you ever encounter ones that do have A or B, that's going to bind to those antibodies and bind to those antigens and destroy them. Okay, the process of clumping up when they bind together, so the antigen and the antibody clumping together, that's called agglutination. And so if you give somebody the wrong blood type, they're going to bind to each other, and that's going to cause clumping and will destroy the transfused red blood cells. Okay, and that's why we care about it, because you can't give them the wrong blood cell or you will kill them. Okay, so what I want you to do is, based on that information alone, so based on the idea of which antibodies bind to which antigens, you should be able to figure out who gives to whom and who receives to whom. So just remember that if I'm type A, I want to get rid of anything that's type B. So the first thing you want to do is finish up the column that tells me which antibodies there are, and then use that information to figure out who can receive, who can donate to, and who can receive from. Now, one common mistake is, don't forget that you can always donate or receive from your own blood type. Don't forget that piece. Here is the answers. It's also on Canvas. Okay.